My name is Charmaine. I am 35 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful software developer, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale Thanksgiving brunch to catch up. Between mimosas and avocado toast, my mother leaned forward smirking. You know, Charmaine, you are lucky we even include you. Pity goes a long way. I simply sipped my coffee and smiled. That night, I logged in, disabled every family credit account, and emailed my lawyer about selling the cabin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Fairfield, Connecticut meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our four-bedroom house with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom painted pale blue at my mother Elaine's insistence, despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary and my prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight grades, joined honor societies, and desperately tried to earn a fraction of the warmth she showered on my younger sister. Nothing was ever enough. I was the difficult child, the one who asked too many questions and chose coding over debutante balls. My parents never understood my fascination with computers and algorithms. They wanted a socialite, but they got an engineer. Fast forward to last Sunday. The annual Thanksgiving family brunch was held at the Belmont Country Club. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting warm light on white linen tablecloths and heavy silver cutlery. The entire extended family was there, aunts, uncles, and cousins who always looked at me like I was an alien species. I wore a tailored cream silk blouse, a rare splurge to celebrate my recent promotion to senior lead developer. I sat near the end of the table trying to blend in, but my mother Elaine had other plans. She sat at the head of the table holding court in her expensive designer dress. Beside her sat my sister, the golden child, who had recently married a wealth management heir. They spent the first hour bragging about their lavish vacations and exclusive club memberships. I stayed quiet, picking at my food and counting the minutes until I could politely leave. The conversation eventually shifted to real estate and the stock market. My sister was loudly complaining about the high interest rates preventing them from buying a second vacation home in the Hamptons. I casually mentioned that the housing market was indeed tricky right now, but there were good investment opportunities if you looked closely at distressed properties. The table fell completely silent. Elaine set her silver fork down with a loud clink that echoed across the dining room. She looked at me with a mixture of amusement and utter disdain. Oh, Charmaine, she sighed loudly enough for the neighboring tables to hear. Please do not lecture us on investments. We all know you just type on a computer all day. Real wealth is built through legacy and pedigree, not whatever little tech hobby you are doing to pay your rent. My face felt hot, but I kept my composure. I politely reminded her that my tech career had just landed me a director-level position and a very comfortable salary. My sister rolled her eyes and reached across the table for the bottle of expensive red wine. You are always so defensive, Charmaine, she sneered. You cannot even handle a simple family discussion without trying to prove you are somehow better than us. You have always been jealous of my success, and Mom knows it. As she pulled the bottle back toward her glass, her hand suddenly jerked forward. A generous splash of dark crimson wine flew directly across the table, landing squarely on the chest of my cream silk blouse. The delicate fabric absorbed it, instantly blooming into a massive, humiliating stain right over my heart. I gasped, standing up quickly and pushing my chair back. My sister did not even offer a napkin or a genuine apology. She just laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that cut through the background music. Oops, she said with a dramatically fake pout. My hand slipped. Maybe next time do not wear something you cannot afford to replace. I looked at my mother, expecting her to reprimand my sister for such blatant disrespect. Instead, Elaine was smiling softly, taking a slow sip of her mimosa. "Well, Charmaine," my mother said smoothly, "that is what happens when you try to sit at a table where you simply do not belong. Go to the restroom and clean yourself up immediately. You are embarrassing the family in front of polite society." My uncles chuckled quietly, and my aunts went right back to eating their expensive meals. Nobody offered to help me. Nobody asked if I was all right. They just sat there enjoying my public humiliation like it was the main course. A strange sense of profound clarity washed over me in that exact moment. The anger I had carried for 35 years suddenly evaporated, leaving behind a cold, calculated calm. I realized that they truly believed I was far beneath them. They believed they were the untouchable elites holding all the power. They had no idea that for the past 3 years I had been the anonymous buyer purchasing their mounting debts. I was the silent owner of the family cabin in Vermont. The credit cards they were using to pay for this very brunch were secondary cards linked to my corporate account. I looked at my mother, then at my sister. "You are absolutely right, Elaine," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "I do not belong at this table. Enjoy your meal." I slowly turned and walked away. As I navigated the maze of elegantly set tables toward the exit, my heart hammered in my chest. I expected to hear the heavy footsteps of my husband Marcus following close behind me. We had been married for 2 years, and he always promised to be my sanctuary away from my toxic family. I reached the grand foyer of the country club and paused near the valet stand waiting for him. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The heavy oak doors finally swung open, but Marcus was not rushing to my side with concern. He strolled out casually, checking his gold watch with an irritated sigh. "You always make a scene, Charmaine," he muttered, handing his ticket to the valet. I stared at him in disbelief. My silk blouse was still clinging to my skin, soaked in red wine, and my husband was annoyed at me. I asked him how he could just sit there while my sister humiliated me. Marcus rolled his eyes, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Your sister was joking," he said condescendingly. "You are too sensitive. This is how wealthy families communicate. They poke fun. You need to learn how to take a joke instead of storming off and embarrassing me in front of the people who matter." Before I could process this, the doors opened again. My sister and her husband Chad stepped out. Chad was a tall, white corporate lawyer born into generational wealth. He always looked at me like I was a charity case his family was forced to endure. He walked over with a smug grin, jingling his Porsche keys. "Marcus is right," Chad said, leaning against a pillar. "You really need to thicken your skin. Charmaine, I know you feel you must fight for everything because you are just a coder playing in the big leagues. But this is the real world. Wealthy people do not throw tantrums over spilled wine. They buy a new shirt and move on." He chuckled, glancing at Marcus, who actually nodded in agreement. "Look at you," Chad continued in a mockingly sympathetic tone. "You do well for yourself with your little computer job, but you do not understand the pressures of real money. My wife just wants to enjoy her brunch without you projecting your insecurities onto everyone. You should be grateful we even invite you to these things. It is good for you to see how the other half lives." The sheer audacity of his words hung in the heavy air between us. Here was Chad, a man who secretly remortgaged his house twice, lecturing me about real money. And right next to him stood my husband, the man who vowed to protect me, offering a soft chuckle of agreement to another man, insulting his wife. Marcus looked at me and sighed. "Just apologize tomorrow, Charmaine. We are riding back with Chad. You can take an Uber, I need to network." I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear. I simply nodded, turned around and ordered a car. The ride back to my house was completely silent. I watched the sprawling mansions of Fairfield blur past the tinted window of the sedan. My mind was no longer clouded by hurt or a desperate desire for their validation. For years I had played the quiet, humble daughter I let them believe my software company was just a small freelance gig to keep their fragile egos intact. I let Chad parade around acting like a financial genius while he secretly blew through his trust fund. I let my mother look down on me from her imaginary pedestal. And I let my husband believe he was the successful one in our marriage while I silently paid off his hidden debts. When I arrived at the empty house, I threw the ruined silk blouse straight into the kitchen trash can. I went directly into my home office and locked the heavy mahogany door behind me. I sat down at my desk and booted up my encrypted workstation. It was time they learned exactly who they had been mocking all these years. My software development company was not a small operation. We built the secure financial infrastructure used by the very private equity firm that currently held every single debt my family owed. 3 years ago, when they were all secretly drowning in liabilities, I quietly established a shell corporation to buy up their debts. I wanted to protect them from bankruptcy because despite everything, they were still my family. But tonight, I was no longer their silent savior. Tonight, I became their collector. I opened the master financial dashboard. The blue glow of the dual monitors illuminated the dark room, casting sharp shadows against the walls. I took a deep breath, letting the cold logic of the code replace any lingering warmth I had for the people who had abandoned me. With my first click, I logged into the family trust and instantly suspended the platinum credit cards my mother and sister were currently using to buy their luxury goods. With my second click, I froze the corporate accounts tied to Chad's failing wealth management firm, severing his access to the capital he desperately needed by tomorrow morning. With my third click, I authorized the immediate foreclosure process on my parents' cherished Vermont cabin, which they had secretly mortgaged to the maximum limit months ago. And with my fourth click, I completely drained the joint savings account. Marcus and I shared transferring every single penny to a secure offshore account, in my name alone, leaving him with an exact balance of zero. I closed the laptop with a satisfying snap. The silence in the empty house felt entirely different now. It was no longer the silence of a victim running away to hide. It was the absolute, terrifying silence of a predator waiting for the dawn. Tomorrow morning, they were all going to wake up to a reality they could never code their way out of. The morning sun streamed through the expansive bay windows of my living room, but I felt no warmth, just a cold anticipation. I sat at the kitchen island, sipping black coffee and watching my phone screen. The first sign of the impending explosion arrived exactly at 8 in the morning. My phone buzzed with an automated alert from the family trust account. Multiple transaction declines were registering in real time. I opened the banking app and watched the glorious cascade of red notifications. Someone was frantically trying to process a $12,000 charge at a luxury boutique in Paris. Then, an $8,000 charge at a high-end resort in Aspen. The system identified the user as Chloe, my 19-year-old niece, the spoiled daughter of my sister and Chad. They had always bragged about sending her to an elite private university, completely debt-free, funded by the ironclad family trust. What they did not realize was that their trust had dried up 2 years ago, and I had been quietly funding the entire charade to spare my mother the public embarrassment. Now the safety net was gone. Another alert chimed. This time, it was from the university bursar office confirming the massive tuition chargeback had been successfully processed. I leaned back against the cool granite counter and waited. 10 minutes later, the silence of my house was shattered by my cell phone ringing violently. The caller ID flashed my sister's name. I let it ring. She called again, then a third time. Finally, I answered, putting the phone on speaker and setting it gently on the counter. Yes, I said, my voice perfectly flat and devoid of emotion. Charmaine. My sister screamed through the speaker, her voice shrill and echoing with panic. You need to call your bank right now. Someone has hacked the family accounts and stolen our identities. Chloe is stuck at a boutique, and all 4 of her platinum cards are declining. The teller is looking at her like she is a common criminal. Fix this. You are supposed to be the tech genius. I took a slow sip of my coffee, allowing her frantic breathing to fill the silence. No one hacked the accounts, I replied calmly. The accounts are functioning exactly as they should. What are you talking about? She demanded. Her voice was trembling now, a mixture of rage and sudden confusion. The trust pays for everything. Dad set it up before he died. It is ironclad. You know this. I shook my head even though she could not see me. The trust went bankrupt 30 months ago, I said, clearly enunciating every syllable. Chad made several catastrophic investments with his wealth management firm and drained the principal to cover his tracks. He remortgaged the cabin and liquidated the remaining assets. Your entire life of luxury has been funded by a private equity firm that bought your debt. A firm that I own. I cut off the funding last night at midnight. There was a long, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of Chad yelling something in the background. You are lying, my sister finally whispered, her voice shaking. You are just trying to get back at us for the wine at brunch. You do not have that kind of money. You are just a coder. I smiled, looking at the framed photograph of my software company team on the wall. I am the chief executive officer of a cybersecurity and financial infrastructure firm, I said gently. We process billions of dollars a year. Your husband is a terrible lawyer and an even worse investor. Look at your email. I just forwarded you the legal transfer of the trust administration. I own the accounts. I own the cabin. And as of midnight, I own your debt. Just then, another voice pierced through the background of the call. It was Chloe, sobbing hysterically. Mom, she wailed. I just got an email from the dean of students. My tuition payment bounced. The school reversed the wire transfer. They are threatening to drop all my classes and evict me from the sorority house if the balance is not paid by noon. What is going on? Why is my card declining? I listened to the absolute chaos erupting on their end of the line. My sister tried to shush her daughter while Chad started swearing loudly. I could picture them standing in their massive custom-built kitchen, suddenly realizing the floor beneath them had completely vanished. Charmaine, my sister said, her voice dropping its usual haughty tone, replaced by a desperate tremor. You need to turn the cards back on. Please. Chloe has her midterms next week. You cannot ruin her college career over a silly argument at brunch. We are family. I felt a sharp pang in my chest, not of guilt, but of vindication. Family. I repeated the word, tasting its bitter irony. Family does not sit around a table and laugh while one of their own is covered in wine. Family does not tell me to know my place and call me a charity case. You all made it very clear yesterday that I do not belong in your world. So I am removing myself from it. And I am taking my money with me. I pressed the end call button, terminating the connection. The silence returned to my kitchen. It was a peaceful quiet, unlike any I had ever experienced in that house. My phone screen lit up again, displaying an incoming call from Marcus, my loving husband. I stared at his name, watching the display flash. I felt absolutely nothing for him anymore. The illusion of my marriage and my toxic family was permanently broken. I slowly picked up the phone, pressed the block button, and firmly set it face down on the granite counter. Today, all their credit cards aggressively declined. Tomorrow, their entire arrogant reality would completely shatter. I barely had time to set my phone down before the heavy mahogany front door of my house burst open. Marcus stormed into the foyer, his face flushed purple with rage. He had evidently realized he was blocked because he was clutching his phone like he wanted to crush it into dust. Charmaine, he bellowed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. Get out here right now! I stepped out of the kitchen and leaned casually against the archway, crossing my arms. He marched toward me, his expensive leather shoes stomping heavily against the hardwood floor. Do you think this is some kind of sick game? He demanded, stopping just a few feet away. I just tried to pay the driver, and my primary card was declined. Then I checked our joint savings, and the balance is zero. Where is my money? I looked at him without blinking. Your money? I asked, raising an eyebrow. I think you mean my money, Marcus. I funded that joint account entirely from my corporate dividends. You have not contributed a single dollar to it in over 18 months. You spent your salary on custom-tailored suits and country club memberships to impress Chad. I simply withdrew my own capital. Marcus sneered, stepping closer to intimidate me. You are my wife, he snarled. What is yours is mine. You will log back onto your little computer and reverse that transfer immediately, or I will drag you to court and take half of everything you own. You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with. I could not help but laugh. The sound caught him completely off guard. He stepped back, his expression shifting from rage to genuine confusion. You are threatening to take half of my assets, I said, walking slowly toward him, forcing him to yield space. That is a brilliant legal strategy, Marcus. Please call a lawyer, because during the discovery phase they will find out that your personal business has been operating at a massive loss for 2 years. They will find the secret offshore accounts where you tried to hide debt from me. And they will definitely find out that the only reason you are not currently in federal prison for defrauding your investors is because Vesper Capital quietly bought out your angry creditors. Marcus froze, completely paralyzed by the name of my firm. How do you know about Vesper Capital? He whispered, his voice suddenly lacking all of its previous bravado. Before I could deliver the final blow, the sound of screeching tires violently interrupted us. We both turned toward the front window. Chloe had just recklessly swerved her gleaming white luxury vehicle into my driveway, stopping at an awkward angle across the manicured lawn. She leaped out of the driver's seat, leaving the door wide open. She was hysterical, mascara running down her cheeks, clutching her useless platinum cards. Uncle Marcus, she shrieked, sprinting toward the front porch. You have to make her stop. She ruined my life. She ruined everything. Marcus yanked the front door open, stepping out onto the porch to intercept the panicked teenager. Calm down, Chloe, he commanded, trying to regain his authority. I am handling this. But he was not handling anything. A massive, heavy-duty tow truck with flashing yellow lights swung into the driveway directly behind the luxury vehicle, blocking it from moving. 2 men in high-visibility vests jumped out of the cab. One of them held a thick metal clipboard and immediately began unwinding a heavy steel chain. Hey, Chloe screamed, sprinting back down the steps toward her car. What are you doing? Get away from my car! Do you have any idea who my family is? The larger man barely glanced at her as he hooked the chain to the front axle of the luxury SUV. I do not care if you are royalty, kid, he grunted, securing the winch. This vehicle is being repossessed for breach of contract and severe delinquency. Marcus marched down the driveway, puffing out his chest. Listen here, buddy, he barked, pointing a finger at the repo man. I am a highly respected businessman in this town. You are making a massive mistake. That vehicle is fully paid for by our family trust. You unhook that truck right now, or I will have the police here in 3 minutes for grand theft auto. The repo man let out a dry, raspy laugh. He pulled a single sheet of paper from his clipboard and shoved it directly against Marcus' chest. Read it and weep, pal, he said, pressing a button on his remote. The winch violently whined, pulling the luxury vehicle up onto the flatbed. This car is legally owned by a holding company under Vesper Capital. The courtesy lease was officially terminated at midnight. The car goes back to the bank. Chloe collapsed onto the grass, sobbing uncontrollably as her ultimate status symbol was hauled into the air. Marcus stared at the repossession order, his eyes darting frantically across the text. His face drained of all color, turning an ashen gray. He looked up slowly, turning his gaze from the departing tow truck to where I stood perfectly still on the front porch. You are Vesper Capital. He breathed out, the realization hitting him with the force of a freight train. You bought the debt. I stepped down off the porch, walking right up to him. I did. I replied, my voice sharp as broken glass. I bought your debt to protect you. But yesterday, you chose to protect their arrogance instead of defending your wife. So I am calling in my loans. Pack your bags, Marcus. You have exactly 1 hour to remove your belongings from this property. You cannot kick me out, he stammered, gesturing wildly. This is my house. I smiled, leaning in close so only he could hear me. I bought the mortgage 6 months ago, I whispered. You are trespassing. Please get out before I call security. Marcus stumbled backward, as if I had physically struck him. The color that had rushed to his face just moments ago completely vanished, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. He looked around the grand foyer of the house, staring at the expensive art on the walls and the crystal chandelier above us, as if seeing them for the very first time. "You are bluffing," he stammered, his voice lacking all of its usual booming authority. "You do not have the capital to buy this mortgage. You are just a software developer. You do not own Vesper Capital. This is just some elaborate trick you set up to scare me because you are angry about yesterday." I did not move an inch. I simply reached into the pocket of my slacks, pulled out my phone, and tapped the screen twice. A PDF document appeared displaying the official deed of trust and the mortgage assignment registered with the county clerk. I held the screen up to his face. "Read the registered owner, Marcus," I said softly. It clearly listed Vesper Capital Holdings with my full legal name as the sole managing director. He stared at the glowing screen, his eyes darting back and forth across the legal text. When the reality finally sank in, his shock quickly morphed into a desperate manic energy. He shoved past me, marching toward his mahogany-paneled study. "Fine," he yelled over his shoulder. "Keep the damn house, Charmaine. I do not need it. My company generates tens of millions of dollars in revenue. I will just buy a better estate by the end of the week. You think seizing a house and a leased car makes you powerful? I'm going to transfer $1 million into the account of Chloe right now just to prove how insignificant you are." He slammed the heavy study doors behind him, but they did not catch the latch properly, leaving a slight gap. I slowly followed him, standing silently outside the doorway, listening to the frantic clicking of his keyboard. Through the gap, I watched him boot up his massive desktop monitor and hastily type in his corporate credentials. He was sweating profusely now, his expensive silk shirt clinging to his back. "I am going to bury you in litigation, Charmaine," he muttered to himself, completely unaware that I was watching. "I will wire the funds, pay off the tuition, buy Chloe a new car, and then I am hiring the best divorce attorneys in the state to gut your little software company." I leaned against the wall, checking my watch. I knew exactly what he was seeing on his screen. 2 years ago, Marcus had leveraged every single asset his company owned to secure a massive bridge loan. He needed the cash to cover up a string of disastrous investments he had made, trying to keep up with my brother-in-law, Chad. When he defaulted on that loan, Vesper Capital stepped in and purchased the debt at a steep discount. Attached to that debt was an ironclad covenant, giving me the right to freeze all corporate operating accounts the moment the company failed to meet its modified payment schedule, a Schedule 1 I had secretly been covering with my own money until last night. I heard Marcus curse loudly. The sharp sound of his hand slamming against the wooden desk echoed into the hallway. "Declined," he hissed, staring at the monitor. "What do you mean, declined?" He frantically clicked his mouse, refreshing the web page over and over again. "Error code 704, account restricted." He snatched his cell phone from the desk and dialed a number with trembling fingers. "Pick up, pick up, pick up," he chanted, pacing back and forth behind his desk. Finally, someone answered. "David, it is Marcus," he barked into the phone, his voice cracking with panic. "Why the hell is the corporate portal locking me out? I am trying to wire $1 million to a personal account, and it is giving me a restriction error. I need you to bypass this right now." There was a pause. Even through the heavy oak door, I could hear the tinny voice of his chief financial officer on the other end of the line. I stepped slightly closer to the opening. "Marcus." The voice sounded terrified. "I was just about to call you. It is not a glitch. The bank just called me. They have completely frozen all of our operating accounts, every single one of them. We cannot wire $1 million. We cannot even buy a cup of coffee." Marcus stopped pacing. "What are you talking about, David?" he demanded. "We have over $4 million in liquid capital in the primary account. Unfreeze it immediately." "We do not have anything, Marcus," David replied, his voice trembling. "The bank received an emergency injunction this morning from our primary debt holder, Vesper Capital. They executed the default clause on the bridge loan. They placed a hard lien on all cash assets. They swept the accounts, Marcus. The money is gone. The phone slipped from his hand, clattering against the hardwood floor. He collapsed into his heavy leather desk chair, staring blankly at the wall. The illusion of his immense wealth, his power, his status, it had all evaporated in less than 12 hours. He was not a titan of industry anymore. He was just a broke man sitting in a house he no longer owned, entirely at the mercy of the woman he had allowed his family to openly humiliate. I pushed the study door completely open. The hinges squeaked slightly, breaking the dead silence in the room. He slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes were wide, filled with a profound, terrifying realization. "You swept the accounts," he whispered, his voice completely hollow. "You took everything." I walked into the room and stopped directly in front of his desk. "I did not take anything from you. I merely reclaimed what was legally mine." I continued, my voice steady and devoid of sympathy. "You handed over the keys to your kingdom 2 years ago when you signed that bridge loan agreement. You took my money to cover your failures, and you agreed to the terms. I am just enforcing the contract." The speakerphone on the floor crackled loudly, interrupting us. David, the chief financial officer, was still on the active line. His frantic breathing echoed in the quiet mahogany study. "Marcus, what is happening?" David pleaded, his voice bordering on tears. "The payroll checks for this week are bouncing. Our suppliers are calling my personal cell phone, threatening to sue us for immediate breach of contract. Who is Vesper Capital, and why do they have absolute legal authority over our financial ledgers?" Marcus scrambled out of his heavy leather chair, dropping to his knees to snatch the cell phone from the hardwood floor. He gripped the device so tightly, his knuckles turned white. "David, listen to me," he barked desperately, trying to regain his authoritative tone. "Call the corporate bank fraud department right this second. Tell them we have been the victims of a massive coordinated cyber attack. Tell them my wife hacked our internal network. She is a software developer, David. She wrote malicious code and bypassed the banking security protocols to freeze the accounts. Tell them to reverse the sweep immediately." There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. David let out a long, defeated sigh. "Marcus, I cannot do that," David replied, sounding utterly exhausted. The bank manager already sent over the legal documentation. This was not a hack. This was a fully authorized financial seizure. They provided signed contracts, notarized deeds, and court-approved injunctions. "Vesper Capital holds our original promissory notes. You defaulted on the modified payment schedule at midnight. The bank is legally obligated to comply with the primary lien holder. If I call the fraud department, they will just laugh at me. We are completely bankrupt, Marcus. We have negative balances and cascading penalty fees. It is over." Marcus stared at the phone, as if it had suddenly turned into a venomous snake. "You are fired, David," he screamed into the receiver. "You are completely incompetent. I will call the bank myself and fix this." He pressed the end call button with a violently shaking thumb and threw the phone onto the desk. He stood up slowly, towering over me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You think you are so smart, Charmaine," he hissed, taking a threatening step forward. "You think you can use your little computer skills to destroy my life. I know exactly what you did. You did not buy my debt. You do not have millions of dollars sitting in a private equity firm. You hacked into my company's servers. You stole my financial credentials while I was sleeping, and you fabricated these electronic documents to make it look like a foreclosure." I stood my ground, refusing to step back or show even a fraction of fear. "That is a fascinating theory, Marcus," I replied calmly. "But it is completely delusional. You know your signature is on those loan documents. You know you took the money. You just cannot handle the reality that the woman you allowed your family to abuse is the only reason you have not been living on the street for the past 2 years. Marcus shook his head furiously, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the expensive facade he worked so hard to maintain. "No," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger right at my face. "You are nothing but a bitter, jealous coder. You saw how my family lives. You saw the pedigree and the generational wealth, and it drove you absolutely insane. You knew you would never truly belong with us, so you decided to tear us down. You hacked the university system to reverse Chloe tuition. You hacked the auto dealership to recall her lease. And now you have hacked my corporate bank. This is cyber terrorism, Charmaine. I watched him spiral into his own frantic delusions. It was pathetic, really. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the perception of wealth and dominance, and now that the foundation had vanished, he was desperately clinging to any narrative that made him the victim. You are projecting, Marcus. I said, my voice dropping to a low, serious register. You are the fraud. You lied to me from the day we met. You pretended to be a successful entrepreneur when you were actually drowning in toxic debt. You used my love as a shield while you and your brother-in-law paraded around the country club playing pretend with my money. I gave you a chance to be a real partner, but you chose to align yourself with a family that sees me as garbage. So I took the trash out. You are going to federal prison for this, he threatened, stepping even closer until I could smell the stale coffee and panic on his breath. I am calling the authorities right now. I am going to tell them my wife is a deranged hacker who committed massive corporate sabotage. They are going to seize your computers. They are going to lock you in a cell for 20 years. And I am going to sue you for every penny you ever earn for the rest of your miserable life. He turned back to his desk, frantically searching for the office landline telephone since he had just broken his cell phone in his rage. I simply crossed my arms and watched him tear the room apart. Please call them Marcus, I invited, gesturing toward the phone, sitting near his expensive leather binder. Call the police. Call the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Let them bring their forensic accountants to audit your books. Because when they do, they will not find any hacked code or fabricated documents. They will find the offshore accounts where you tried to hide company funds from the Internal Revenue Service. They will find the forged invoices Chad helped you create to artificially inflate your quarterly earnings. If you invite law enforcement into this house, Marcus, you are the one leaving in handcuffs. He froze, his hand hovering inches above the telephone receiver. He knew I was telling the truth. The bluff was completely dismantled. The silence in the study grew heavy, suffocating him with the weight of his own lies. But Marcus was not the kind of man to surrender gracefully. If he could not win with facts, he would try to win with brute force and intimidation. He slowly lowered his hand from the phone, and a dark, malicious smile crept across his face. You think you have outsmarted me? He whispered, his voice trembling with rage. You forgot one very important detail, Charmaine. You are completely alone in this house with me. Just as he took another step toward me, the shrill sound of the front doorbell echoed through the massive foyer downstairs, followed by loud, aggressive knocking on the heavy oak door. Marcus glared at me, breathing heavily. We both knew exactly who was on the other side of that door. The real battle was just beginning. Marcus stepped back away from me, his dark smile faltering at the sudden loud knocking. He rushed out of the study and practically ran to the front foyer. I followed closely behind him, keeping my distance but refusing to retreat. He yanked the heavy oak doors open. Standing on the front porch was my brother-in-law, Chad. He was not alone. Flanking him on either side were two broad-shouldered police officers in full uniform. Chad stood there wearing his expensive tailored navy suit, a smug, victorious grin plastered across his face. He looked past Marcus and locked his eyes directly on me. Officer, that is the woman, Chad said, pointing an accusatory finger in my direction. That is Charmaine Brooks. She is the one who committed the cyber attack. Marcus let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, playing the role of the victimized husband perfectly. Thank God you are here, Chad, he said, stepping aside to let the men into the foyer. She has gone completely insane. She locked my corporate accounts and stole every penny from our joint savings. The two officers stepped into the house, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. They looked around the opulent entryway, taking in the crystal chandelier and the imported marble floors before looking at me. Mom, one of the officers said, his voice stern and authoritative. We received an emergency call from this attorney stating that a massive corporate embezzlement is currently in progress. We need you to step away from all electronic devices and keep your hands where we can see them. I did not raise my voice or show any signs of panic. I simply stood with my arms relaxed at my sides and looked directly at the officer. I am not near any devices, officer, I replied calmly. And there is no embezzlement in progress. You have been dragged into a civil financial dispute by a man who does not know how to pay his debts. Chad stepped forward, invading my personal space. His smugness was radiating off him in waves. Save the lies, Charmaine, he sneered. You are not dealing with gullible family members anymore. You are dealing with the law. Marcus called me in a panic 10 minutes ago. I know exactly what you did. You used your tech background to hack into his corporate network. You bypassed the security firewalls and illegally transferred millions of dollars into offshore accounts. That is corporate espionage, grand larceny, and federal wire fraud. You are looking at decades in federal prison. I looked at Chad, taking in his flushed face and the desperate way he was clutching his leather briefcase. He was trying to use legal buzzwords to intimidate me in front of the police. He wanted to scare me into compliance. Is that your official legal opinion, Chad? I asked, tilting my head slightly. Because as a wealth management attorney, I would expect you to understand the difference between a cyber attack and a legal debt collection. But then again, considering the state of your own finances, I suppose your legal expertise is highly questionable. Chad's face turned a violent shade of red. Shut your mouth, he snapped, losing his composed lawyer persona for a fraction of a second. He turned to the officers. Gentlemen, she is a disgruntled spouse having a mental breakdown. She has already admitted to shutting down the credit cards of my teenage daughter and reversing her college tuition out of pure spite. Now she is holding a multi-million-dollar company hostage. We need her removed from the premises immediately. She poses a flight risk and a direct threat to the financial security of my client. Marcus chimed in, standing safely behind Chad. Yes, she needs to leave, he demanded. This is my house. She is trespassing and destroying my life. I want her arrested right now. The older of the two police officers held up his hand, signaling for everyone to calm down. Sir, we cannot just arrest someone without proof of a crime, the officer explained patiently. And if this is your marital home, we cannot legally force your wife to leave without a formal eviction notice or a domestic violence restraining order. This sounds like a complex civil matter regarding marital assets and business accounts. Chad scoffed, adjusting his expensive silk tie. This is not a simple divorce dispute, officer. This is an active crime scene. She used the computers in that room right there to execute the hack. I am formally requesting that you confiscate her laptop, her phone, and all network routers as digital evidence. Furthermore, as the legal counsel for the family, I am demanding that she hand over the encryption keys to reverse the stolen funds. If she complies right now and restores the company ledgers, I might be able to convince the board of directors not to press federal charges. It was a beautiful performance. Chad was playing the magnanimous lawyer, offering me a fake lifeline while simultaneously trying to strip me of all my leverage. He thought I was just a scared little software developer who would crumble at the sight of a police badge. He thought I would rush upstairs, unlock my laptop, and give him back the money he desperately needed to maintain his fake aristocratic lifestyle. I looked at Marcus, who was smiling again, believing that his big brother-in-law had swooped in to save the day. I turned my attention back to the two officers who were looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. Officers, I said, my voice projecting clearly through the large open foyer. My husband and his brother-in-law are lying to you. They are attempting to use the police department as a private collection agency. I did not hack anything. I am the sole managing director of a private equity firm called Vesper Capital. 2 years ago, my firm purchased the defaulted commercial loans of my husband. Last night, he failed to meet the terms of his repayment contract. The bank executed a standard financial seizure this morning, based on legally binding documents. Chad let out a loud, obnoxious laugh, cutting me off. Do you hear this? He asked the officer, shaking his head. She is completely delusional. Vesper Capital is a ghost company. She made it up. She is a freelance coder who works in her pajamas. She does not have the capital to buy a sandwich, let alone a multi-million-dollar commercial loan. She is stalling because she knows she is caught. Arrest her now before she transfers the money to a country without an extradition treaty. I watched Chad carefully. His arrogance was his greatest weakness. He was so convinced of his own superiority that he never bothered to do a simple background check on the woman he mocked at the dinner table. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The officers tensed slightly, but I moved very slowly. "If you want digital evidence, Chad," I said, "I am happy to provide it. But we do not need to confiscate my computers. We just need to wait for my guests to arrive." Marcus frowned, his brief moment of confidence wavering. "Guests," he repeated. "What guests?" I looked out the large glass panels surrounding the front door. Right on cue, a sleek black town car pulled into the circular driveway, parking directly behind the police cruiser. Two men and one woman wearing sharp tailored suits stepped out of the vehicle carrying thick leather briefcases. They walked purposefully toward the front porch. I turned back to the officers and smiled. "Those are my corporate attorneys," I explained. "They represent Vesper Capital. And they have brought all the original signed promissory notes, the notarized deeds, and the federal injunctions that prove everything I just said." Chad stared through the glass, his smug expression finally cracking. The reality of the situation was starting to dawn on him. This was not a bluff. This was not a hack. The police were not going to save them. The trap I had carefully laid out over the past 2 years had just snapped completely shut. The three individuals standing on the porch exuded absolute corporate authority. The lead attorney, a tall woman, walked through the doorway without waiting for an invitation. "Good morning, officers," she said. "I am Eleanor Vance, representing Vesper Capital. There is a misunderstanding regarding a financial seizure here today." Chad crossed his arms. "This is no misunderstanding," he snapped. "This woman just admitted to hacking a corporate network. You cannot just walk in here and pretend this is a legal repossession. This is a crime scene." Eleanor did not even bother looking at Chad. She turned to the police, pulling a stack of folders from a briefcase. "My client, Charmaine Brooks, directs Vesper Capital," she explained. "Here are the loan agreements signed by Marcus Brooks. These injunctions grant my client control over all linked accounts. This is a fully documented civil matter involving corporate debt default. There is absolutely no criminal activity occurring here today." The officer began scanning the documents. He recognized the court seals. He looked up at Chad, looking annoyed. "These are valid court orders," the officer said. "This injunction gives Vesper Capital full legal authority to freeze the assets." "Why did you call us out here claiming a cyber attack was in progress? You are wasting valuable police resources on a private business failure. We have real crimes to investigate." Chad swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the folder. "That paperwork has to be forged." He insisted, though his voice lacked its previous venom. "She is a software developer. She does not own a private equity firm. I demand to see those documents." Eleanor smiled a cold, predatory smile that made Chad step back. "You are welcome to review them, counselor," she said, handing a duplicate folder to him. "I recommend you read page 4, where your brother-in-law put up this estate as collateral." Marcus let out a strangled gasp. He lunged forward, snatching the folder right out of Chad's hands. "What is she talking about?" Marcus demanded, flipping frantically through the pages. "I did not put the house up for collateral. The house is protected under the family trust. You told me the trust was bulletproof, Chad." Chad looked at the floor, suddenly very interested in the marble tiles. "Well, Marcus," he mumbled nervously, "the trust was solid. But when you insisted on taking that massive bridge loan, you needed liquid assets to secure it. You signed a waiver. I told you it was risky. You told me it was a formality." Marcus screamed, his face turning a blotchy red. "You told me the lenders would never actually come after the primary residence." Eleanor cleared her throat, bringing the attention back to her. "They would not have come after the residence if you had made your payments, Mr. Brooks," she stated matter-of-factly. "But since you defaulted, the property entered the foreclosure process 6 months ago." My client purchased the defaulted mortgage directly from the bank. She gestured to her associate, who handed a single sheet of heavy stock paper to the police officers. That is the registered deed of trust, Eleanor continued. As you can see, the property located at this address is legally owned by Vesper Capital Holdings. Marcus Brooks has been living here under a courtesy grace period, which my client officially revoked this morning. Therefore, the only people currently trespassing on this property are Mr. Brooks and his attorney. The silence that followed was absolute. The reality of the situation crashed down on Marcus and Chad with the weight of a collapsing building. They were not just broke, they were homeless. The grand estate, the crystal chandeliers, the imported marble floors, none of it belonged to them anymore. It all belonged to the woman they had relentlessly mocked and belittled just 12 hours ago at a family brunch. The younger police officer handed the deed back to Eleanor and turned to Marcus. "Sir," he said, his tone completely devoid of sympathy, "it looks like you do not own this house anymore. The legal owner is standing right there, and her attorneys have the paperwork to prove it. Since there is no crime being committed here, we are going to leave. But I suggest you start packing your belongings, because if she calls us back to report a trespasser, we will have to escort you off the premises in handcuffs." Marcus looked like he was going to be physically sick. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. "Charmaine," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, you cannot do this. Where am I supposed to go?" I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. I thought about the way he had dismissed my humiliation last night. I thought about the way he had laughed with Chad, calling me a charity case who needed to learn her place. I had spent 2 years secretly protecting this man, shielding him from the consequences of his own arrogance, and he had rewarded my loyalty with complete betrayal. "You can go wherever you want, Marcus," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "But you cannot stay here. You have 45 minutes to gather your personal items and leave my property." Chad tried to salvage some shred of his dignity. "This is not over, Charmaine," he threatened, pointing a shaking finger at me. "I am going to take this to federal court. I am going to bury you in litigation. You think you have won, but I will tear your little company apart." I turned my gaze to Chad. He was still trying to play the big-shot lawyer, completely oblivious to the fact that his own world was about to come crashing down. I smiled, stepping closer to him. "Oh, Chad," I said softly, "we are just getting started. Because while Marcus was busy losing his company, I was busy looking into your personal finances. And trust me, what I found there is going to completely destroy you." The 2 police officers had seen enough. The older officer adjusted his duty belt and shook his head, looking at Chad with absolute disgust. "We are leaving," the officer stated flatly. "Do not call us again unless there is an actual physical crime being committed. And Mr. Brooks, I strongly suggest you listen to your wife and her legal team. If we have to come back here to remove you for trespassing, it will not be a polite conversation." The officers turned around and walked out the front door. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them, echoing loudly in the massive foyer. The silence that followed was suffocating. Chad stood frozen, his earlier arrogance completely erased by the threat I had just delivered. But before I could dismantle Chad, Marcus decided to try one last desperate tactic. He realized that intimidation and legal threats were useless against me. The police were not going to save him, and his corporate accounts were drained. So he pivoted to the only weapon he thought he still had left. He tried to use emotion. Marcus suddenly dropped to his knees right there on the imported marble floor. He looked up at me with tears welling in his eyes. "Charmaine, please," he begged, his voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. "Please do not do this to us. We are husband and wife. We took vows. I know I messed up last night. I know I should have defended you when Chloe threw the wine. I was stressed about the company, and I took it out on you. But I love you. We can fix this. Just send your lawyers away and let us sit down like a real family and figure this out." I looked down at the man kneeling before me. A year ago, seeing him like this would have broken my heart. A year ago, I would have done anything to wipe away his tears and reassure him that we were a team. But the woman who loved him died the moment he watched his daughter humiliate me and told me to know my place. I did not feel pity. I only felt a deep, profound sense of clarity. You want to talk about our vows, Marcus? I asked, my voice echoing in the empty foyer. You want to talk about being a real family. Let us talk about the foundation of this marriage. Let us talk about what happened exactly 14 months ago before you even bought my engagement ring. Marcus swallowed hard, looking nervously at Eleanor and the other corporate attorneys standing behind me. What are you talking about? He whispered, his eyes darting frantically. I nodded to Eleanor. She opened a sleek black leather folder and pulled out a stack of financial summaries. 14 months ago, Marcus Brooks was technically insolvent. Eleanor read aloud, her voice clinical and precise. His primary holding company had defaulted on 3 major commercial loans, totaling over $15 million. His personal credit score had plummeted. His investment accounts were completely drained to cover payroll. He was exactly 3 weeks away from filing Chapter 11 bankruptcy and losing everything, including this estate. I stepped closer to Marcus, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. You were drowning, Marcus, I said. You were completely ruined. And then miraculously, you met a quiet software developer who made a very comfortable living. You thought I was just a naive girl with a nice savings account who could help you float your lifestyle for a few more months. You romanced me. You proposed to me. You promised me a lifetime of partnership. But it was all a calculated lie. You did not want a wife. You wanted a human shield. Marcus shook his head frantically. No, Charmaine, that is not true, he pleaded. I loved you. The financial trouble was temporary. I was going to bounce back. I just needed time to restructure the business. You needed a miracle, I corrected him. And I gave you one. When I realized how bad your financial situation was, I did not run away. I loved you so much that I decided to save you. I used Vesper Capital to buy up all of your toxic debt. I paid off your angry creditors. I stabilized your company. I became your secret safety net because I believed in the sanctity of our marriage. I wanted to give you a chance to rebuild your pride without the humiliation of a public bankruptcy. I thought if I quietly supported you, you would eventually become the partner I deserved. I expected loyalty. I expected respect. Instead, you used my capital to fund your delusions of grandeur and treated me like an employee who was lucky to be in your presence. Chad let out a low whistle, staring at Marcus in disbelief. You were bankrupt before the wedding, Chad asked, his voice laced with shock. You told me the company was doing record numbers. You told me you were expanding into commercial real estate and opening new branches on the East Coast. You even convinced me to invest my own trust fund into your imaginary expansion. You have been lying to me this whole time. He lied to everyone, Chad, I said, not taking my eyes off Marcus. He built this entire facade on my money. Every expensive dinner, every country club fee, every tailored suit he bought for the last 2 years was funded by my grace. I gave him the world, and how did he repay me? He treated me like a second-class citizen in my own home. He allowed his family to mock my career and insult my background. He stood by while his daughter threw wine on me and called me a parasite from the slums. Marcus was openly weeping now, his face buried in his hands. I am so sorry, he sobbed. I was too proud. I did not want to admit I had failed. I will change, Charmaine. I swear to God I will change. I will do whatever you want. Just please do not take everything away from me. I have nothing else. I looked down at him, feeling the last remaining thread of my attachment to him completely snap. You already have nothing, Marcus, I said coldly. You have had nothing for a very long time. The only difference is that today, the rest of the world is going to know about it. You wanted me to know my place in this family. Well, my place is at the top, and your place is out the door. I turned to Eleanor. Call the private security firm, I instructed her. Tell them to send a team over immediately to supervise the eviction. Mr. Brooks has exactly 30 minutes to pack a single suitcase of personal clothing. Anything purchased with company funds stays here. Eleanor nodded and pulled out her phone. Marcus remained on the floor, a broken, pathetic shell of the arrogant man he had been just yesterday. But the reckoning was not over yet. I slowly turned my attention back to Chad, who was quietly trying to edge his way toward the front door. "Leaving so soon, Chad?" I asked, my voice cutting through the tension like a physical blade. "We have not even discussed your portfolio yet, and believe me, you are going to want to hear this." Chad stopped dead in his tracks, his hand resting on the heavy brass doorknob. He slowly turned around, his face a mask of forced indifference, but the slight tremor in his jaw gave him away. "What are you talking about, Charmaine?" he asked, trying to project his usual arrogance. "My finances are pristine. I am a senior partner at a wealth management firm. You cannot possibly have anything on me." I walked toward him, the heels of my shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. Eleanor stepped perfectly in sync beside me, holding a thick red folder. "You are a senior partner in name only, Chad," I corrected him. "Your firm has been bleeding clients for 3 years. You have been quietly moving money from smaller accounts to cover the massive losses in your own personal portfolio. You thought you were a genius investor, but the market completely outplayed you." Chad crossed his arms tightly across his chest defensively. "That is pure speculation," he countered, his voice rising an octave. "My firm undergoes annual audits. You have no proof of anything." I nodded to Eleanor, who opened the red folder and extracted a glossy spreadsheet. She handed it directly to Chad. He did not want to take it, but his hands moved on instinct. "Let us talk about your annual trips to Las Vegas." "Chad," I said, leaning slightly closer to him, "you always told my sister you were attending exclusive financial summits at the Bellagio. You told her you were networking with billionaires. But the reality is you were sitting at the high-stakes baccarat tables, desperately trying to chase your market losses." Chad stared at the spreadsheet, his eyes widening in horror. "How did you get these records?" he whispered, the paper shaking violently in his hands. "These are supposed to be completely sealed. When you owe the casinos over $2 million in unpaid markers, privacy is the first thing you lose," I explained, my voice devoid of any sympathy. "The casinos sold your debt to a third-party collection agency last year, and since Vesper Capital specializes in distressed assets, we purchased that debt portfolio for pennies on the dollar. You do not just owe the casinos anymore, Chad. You owe me." Marcus, who was still sitting on the floor nearby, looked up in absolute shock. $2 million, Marcus repeated, staring at his brother-in-law. "You told me you were giving me financial advice. You were bankrupting yourself playing cards." "Shut up, Marcus." Chad snapped desperately, trying to maintain some semblance of control. He looked back at me, his face glistening with cold sweat. "Fine," he hissed, dropping his voice to a whisper, so the security guards waiting outside would not hear. "I owe you the casino money. I will liquidate my stock options. I will set up a payment plan. Just do not tell Vanessa. If my wife finds out about the gambling, she will leave me." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, Chad," I said softly, "the gambling is only the beginning of your problems, because liquidating your stock options will not even cover the interest on your debt. You already sold those options 6 months ago to pay off a separate bookie, and when that money ran out, you had to find a new source of capital to keep your creditors from breaking your legs." I reached into the red folder and pulled out a heavy, stapled document. I held it up so the natural light from the front windows caught the raised notary seal on the final page. "Do you recognize this document, Chad?" I asked. All the blood completely drained from his face. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows. "That is a private banking contract," he stammered, taking a step backward until his shoulders hit the heavy oak door. "You cannot have that. It is the second mortgage on your luxury penthouse. I clarified, speaking loudly enough for everyone in the foyer to hear clearly. You took out a $4 million loan against the property to cover your gambling markers and to maintain the illusion of your immense wealth. But there was a massive problem. The penthouse is legally in both your name and your wife's name. You could not secure the mortgage without her consent. And since you knew she would immediately divorce you if she found out about the debt, you made a very desperate decision. I pointed to the signature line at the bottom of the document. You forged her signature, Chad. You brought in a corrupt notary to stamp it, and you illegally encumbered a property that you only partially own. That is not just bad financial management. That is criminal fraud. That is a felony forgery. Chad completely collapsed against the door, sliding down the wood paneling until he was sitting on the marble floor holding his head in his hands. He looked exactly like Marcus had minutes earlier. Two arrogant men stripped of their fake empires, entirely defeated by the woman they had relentlessly mocked. And just like Marcus Bridge loan, I continued, my voice echoing with finality. Vesper Capital bought the secondary mortgage when the bank packaged it into a high-risk portfolio. You missed your last 3 payments, Chad. The grace period expired yesterday. My firm is officially foreclosing on your penthouse. Chad looked up, his eyes red and frantic. You are taking my home, he gasped. Where are we supposed to live? What are we supposed to tell Chloe? She just got kicked out of her university because you canceled the tuition. Now she has nowhere to live. You are destroying an entire family. I shook my head slowly, rejecting his attempt to make me the villain. I did not force you to gamble away your future, I said firmly. I did not force you to forge your wife's signature, and I certainly did not force your daughter to throw wine on me and call me a parasite. You all built a house of cards fueled by arrogance and greed. All I did was open the front door and let the wind blow it down. Eleanor stepped forward, looking down at Chad with clinical precision. We have already prepared the eviction notices, counselor, she stated, using his professional title as a weapon. Furthermore, we have compiled a full dossier containing the forged mortgage documents, the casino markers, and the evidence of your financial embezzlement. We are legally obligated to report suspected fraud. By 5 o'clock this evening, that dossier will be in the hands of the State Bar Association, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Chad let out a raw, guttural sob. You are going to get me disbarred, he cried, completely losing his composure. I will go to federal prison. Please, Charmaine, I am begging you. I will do anything. I will publicly apologize. I will transfer whatever assets I have left to you. Just please do not send that file to the authorities. My life will be completely over. I looked down at the man who had stood at the country club less than 24 hours ago, telling me I needed to thicken my skin. He had told me to be grateful I was even invited to sit at their table. He had called me a charity case. You told me yesterday that wealthy people do not throw tantrums over spilled wine, I reminded him, my voice perfectly level. You told me this is the real world, and I needed to understand how real money works. Well, Chad, welcome to the real world. You gambled with my money and you lost. I turned my back on him, facing Eleanor. Ensure the documents are filed with the authorities immediately, I instructed her. And call the locksmith. I want every single lock on this estate changed by noon. I do not want these men ever setting foot on my property again. Eleanor nodded curtly, acknowledging my final orders before stepping aside to make the necessary phone calls. Right on schedule, the private security team I had specifically hired for this exact moment arrived. 4 heavily muscular men wearing sharp black suits walked briskly through the open front doors. You heard the lady, the lead guard said, his voice completely uncompromising. You have exactly 30 minutes to pack 1 bag of personal clothing. Move. Marcus slowly pushed himself up from the cold floor, dragging his feet toward the grand staircase, his shoulders slumped in total defeat. Chad remained seated on the marble tiles, staring blankly at the wall. A security guard grabbed Chad by the arm, hauling him roughly to his feet. Just then, the deafening sound of screeching tires echoed loudly from the circular driveway outside. a sleek silver Porsche parked recklessly on the manicured grass, tearing up the expensive landscaping. The heavy driver's side door flew open, and my sister Vanessa sprinted desperately directly toward the house. She wore her tennis outfit, a stark contrast to the absolute panic twisting her face. She ran up the porch steps, bursting into the foyer, her eyes darting frantically between me, Chad the lawyers, and the security guards. "What on earth is happening?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. Chloe called me screaming that her car was towed and her tuition was reversed. The bank just called saying our credit cards are frozen for suspected fraud. "Chad, why are you not answering your phone?" She grabbed his arm, but Chad refused to look at her, staring at the floor, completely drained of blood. "Chad, talk to me," Vanessa demanded, shaking him. "Tell me this is a mistake. Tell me Charmaine did not actually do this to us. We need to call the police." I took a step forward, holding the thick red folder. "The police were already here, Vanessa," I said calmly. "They left because there is no crime being committed by me. The only criminal here is the man you married." Vanessa turned her glare toward me, her blue eyes flashing with venom. "Shut up, Charmaine," she snapped. "You are just trying to ruin my life because you are jealous of my marriage and money." I simply held out the thick red folder. "If you want to know exactly where your money went, Vanessa, I suggest you read this," I said. "But I warn you, the truth is much worse than you can imagine." She snatched the folder from my hands, scoffing loudly. She flipped it open, intending to throw it back in my face. But as her eyes scanned the top page, her mocking expression vanished. Her hands began to tremble. "What is this?" she whispered, her eyes darting across the spreadsheet. "Millions of dollars in casino markers." She looked up at Chad, her voice cracking. "Are you gambling again? You promised me you stopped 5 years ago." Chad swallowed hard, taking a step backward. "Vanessa, sweetie, let me explain," he stammered, reaching a shaking hand toward her. "It was a bad run in the market. I needed to leverage capital to cover client portfolios. I was going to win it back. I had a system. I just needed more time." Vanessa looked completely horrified. $2 million? She gasped, flipping to the next page. "You lost $2 million. How did you even get that kind of credit?" Then she saw the second document, the heavy stapled contract with the raised notary seal. "This is a secondary mortgage agreement on the penthouse," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "This says we borrowed $4 million against our home. But we own the penthouse outright. I never signed a mortgage agreement." I stepped forward, my voice perfectly clear and unwavering. "You did not sign it, Vanessa," I confirmed. "Chad forged your signature. He bribed a notary to certify the documents using your home as collateral to pay off his bookies. He defaulted on the payments. Vesper Capital purchased that defaulted mortgage. The penthouse belongs to me now." Vanessa dropped the red folder, scattering documents across the marble floor. "You actually forged my name," she screamed. "You stole my own home. You lied to me every day." Chad fell to his knees, grasping desperately at her skirt. "Vanessa, please," he sobbed. "I did not want to lose you. Please do not leave me." Vanessa looked down at him with absolute disgust. She raised her hand and delivered a sharp, stinging slap directly across his face. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "Do not ever touch me again," she hissed. "I am calling my divorce attorney right now," she added furiously. She slowly turned back to me, tears streaming down her face. "Charmaine," she pleaded, her voice stripped of its arrogance. "Please, I am your older sister. You cannot take my home. I did not know he forged my name. You have to please let me keep the penthouse. Just please do not put me and Chloe out on the street." I looked at my sister, remembering her cruelty at brunch. "You told me I did not belong at your table, Vanessa," I reminded her softly. "You built your entire life on looking down on me. I am not your safety net anymore. You have until tomorrow morning to vacate." Vanessa let out an agonizing wail, collapsing onto the stairs. The security guards physically dragged Chad out the front door. But the drama was not finished. Out of the corner of my right eye, I saw Marcus sneaking down the back stairs carrying a leather bag. He was frantically and furiously typing on his cell phone, planning something desperate. He thought I was entirely distracted by the complete destruction of my sister and her failing marriage. He thought he could quietly slip out the back entrance to somehow salvage his completely crumbling corporate empire. He had absolutely no idea I was already 10 steps ahead of him. He had absolutely no idea I was already 10 steps ahead of him. I watched Marcus slip through the swinging kitchen doors, his expensive leather duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He moved with the frantic urgency of a rat fleeing a sinking ship. He genuinely believed that the chaos unfolding in the grand foyer with my sister sobbing and Chad hyperventilating had provided him with the perfect cover. He thought he was being stealthy. But my security team had already secured the perimeter, and I had explicitly instructed the lead guard to let him pass. I wanted him to run. I needed him to run. Because a desperate man makes careless mistakes, and I needed Marcus to commit his final fatal error on the record. As the heavy kitchen door swung shut, I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened a secured tracking application. A blinking red dot moved swiftly across the digital map of the estate, heading directly for the back service gates. He was driving the old Range Rover, the only vehicle in the garage not registered under the Vesper Capital corporate lease. I watched the dot accelerate onto the main highway heading downtown. He was going straight to his corporate headquarters. What Marcus did not realize was that his company network was not just frozen, it was fully monitored. When Vesper Capital seized the operating accounts at midnight, my tech team also took administrative control over the internal communication servers. Every email, every text message, every calendar invite he sent was automatically mirrored directly to my secure executive dashboard. I tapped a notification that just popped up on my screen. Marcus had just sent an urgent high-priority calendar invite to his board of directors and his 3 largest minority investors. The subject line read, "Emergency Liquidation and Merger Authorization." He scheduled the meeting for exactly 1 hour from now in the primary executive boardroom. I could vividly picture him driving recklessly, weaving through the mid-morning traffic, gripping the steering wheel with sweaty palms. He was terrified, but his massive ego was telling him he could still win. He planned to convince the board that his accounts were temporarily frozen due to a malicious domestic dispute. He was going to ask them to grant him emergency executive powers to bypass the frozen accounts, liquidate the remaining physical assets, and sell the proprietary software patents to a rival firm for pennies on the dollar. He wanted to secure a golden parachute offshore the cash and leave me holding an empty corporate shell. It was a textbook corporate smash and grab. I turned back to Eleanor, who was finishing her instructions to the security team regarding Chad and Vanessa. "Eleanor," I said quietly, showing her the intercepted calendar invite on my phone. "Marcus just called an emergency board meeting. He is trying to force a liquidation vote to sell the patents before the federal authorities get involved." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, a sharp, predatory smile returning to her face. "That is a direct violation of the federal injunction," she noted, her voice cold and analytical. "If he tries to sell assets under a frozen lien that elevates this from a civil default to federal corporate fraud, he is effectively attempting to steal secured assets." "Exactly," I replied. "Let us give him enough rope to hang himself. Gather the rest of the documents and call our forensic accounting team. Tell them to meet us at the corporate headquarters in 45 minutes. Have them bring the signed injunctions." I did not even look back at my sister, who was still sobbing on the marble stairs, begging the security guards for more time, or Chad, who was being physically escorted out the front door, looking like a dead man walking. Their destruction was complete. They were no longer my concern. I walked out the grand front doors, leaving the toxic legacy of my family behind me, and stepped into the back of the waiting black town car. Eleanor slid in beside me and tapped on the glass divider separating us from the driver. "Downtown," she instructed, "and step on it." As the town car merged onto the highway, I opened my laptop and connected to the boardroom security cameras at his office. I had quietly installed the hidden feeds months ago when I first suspected he was actively hiding money from the marital estate. The high-definition video popped onto my screen with crystal-clear audio. The executive boardroom was mostly empty, but the minority investors were slowly trickling in, looking confused, annoyed, and clutching their briefcases. They murmured among themselves, wondering why they had been summoned so abruptly. Suddenly, the heavy glass doors burst open. Marcus marched into the room. His suit jacket wrinkled, his hair entirely disheveled. He threw his leather bag onto the massive mahogany table and immediately began pacing at the head of the room. I turned up the audio feed, leaning back against the leather seat of the town car to watch the show. Gentleman Marcus said, his voice breathless and frantic, echoing in the large room. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. We are facing an unprecedented crisis. Early this morning, we became the victim of a massive coordinated cyber attack, orchestrated by a disgruntled domestic party. All of our primary operating accounts have been illegally frozen by a fraudulent entity claiming to hold our debt." Gasps and angry murmurs rippled through the boardroom. An older investor near the window stood up, demanding answers. Marcus waved his hands frantically, trying to regain control of the room. "Do not panic," he pleaded desperately, trying to project his usual commanding confidence. "I have a solution. We have a private buyer willing to acquire our patents and physical assets in an all-cash off-market transaction right now. But I need your physical signatures immediately to authorize the emergency transfer before the hackers lock down the physical ledgers. If we do not vote to liquidate in the next 20 minutes, we lose absolutely everything we have built." I watched him lie smoothly to the men who had trusted him with their money. He was sweating profusely, his eyes wild with desperation. He thought he was putting on the performance of a lifetime. He thought he was about to outsmart the financial system and escape with millions of dollars in stolen capital. I closed my laptop with a soft click and looked out the tinted window at the towering glass skyscrapers of the downtown financial district. We were less than 5 minutes away. Marcus was about to learn a very painful lesson. You cannot sell a company to save yourself when your wife already owns the building, the patents, the servers, and the very chair you are currently sitting on. The black town car pulled smoothly to a stop in front of the towering glass and steel facade of the corporate headquarters. I stepped out onto the busy downtown sidewalk, feeling the cool afternoon breeze against my face. Eleanor emerged right behind me, followed closely by a second vehicle carrying 3 of our top forensic accountants. We walked together through the revolving doors and stepped into the expansive marble lobby. Marcus had clearly tried to cover his tracks because the head security guard immediately stepped into our path, holding his hand up. "I am sorry, Mrs. Brooks," the guard said, looking incredibly uncomfortable, "but Mr. Brooks just issued a high-priority alert restricting your access to the building. He stated that you were a corporate security threat and should be escorted off the premises immediately." I did not even break my stride. Eleanor simply stepped forward and handed the guard a copy of the federal injunction with the raised court seal. "That building restriction is entirely invalid," Eleanor stated firmly. "My client is the managing director of Vesper Capital, the entity that now legally controls this commercial property and all of its internal assets. You work for her now." The guard read the first paragraph of the court order, his eyes widening in surprise. He immediately stepped aside and swiped his master keycard to grant us unhindered access to the private executive elevator. The elevator ride to the top floor was swift and completely silent. I watched the floor numbers tick upward on the digital display, feeling a profound sense of finality settling over me. This was the exact building where Marcus had spent the last 2 years pretending to be a titan of industry while secretly drowning in toxic debt and mocking my career. The elevator doors chimed softly and slid open, revealing the plush carpeted hallway of the executive suite. I could hear Marcus speaking loudly from behind the frosted glass doors of the primary boardroom. We paused outside the heavy doors, listening to his desperate pitch. Marcus was practically begging the room. "I know this is highly unusual, gentlemen," Marcus was saying, his voice dripping with false urgency and manufactured panic. but we have to finalize this asset sale right now. The buyers are wiring the funds to an offshore escrow account, which will perfectly protect our remaining capital from this malicious cyber attack. If you do not sign these authorization papers immediately, the hackers will seize the proprietary patents, and we will all be completely ruined. I need your signatures to save the company and protect your investments. I heard the scratching of a pen on paper. One of the minority investors was actually buying his ridiculous story. It was time to pull the plug. I pushed the heavy glass doors open and stepped into the boardroom. My entrance was completely silent, but the sheer presence of my legal team caused the entire room to freeze instantly. Marcus was standing at the head of the long mahogany table, a gold pen in his hand, leaning over a thick stack of liquidation documents. He looked up, and all the color vanished from his face, as if he had seen a ghost. "What are you doing here?" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Security. I need security up here right now to remove this woman." He reached frantically for the phone on the conference table, but Eleanor stepped forward and smoothly placed her hand over the receiver. "There is no need to call security, Marcus," I said, walking slowly and deliberately toward the center of the room. "The security team downstairs already knows that I am the one signing their paychecks today." I looked around the room, making direct eye contact with the 3 minority investors and the 5 board members. They were all staring at me in absolute shock, wondering why the wife of the chief executive was raiding a closed meeting. "Gentlemen," I continued, keeping my voice perfectly level and authoritative, "I apologize for interrupting your emergency meeting, but I strongly advise you to put your pens down immediately. The man standing at the head of this table is attempting to make you all complicit in a massive federal crime." "Do not listen to her," Marcus screamed, pointing a visibly shaking finger at me. "She is the hacker. She is the one who illegally froze our accounts and orchestrated this entire cyber attack. She is having a severe mental breakdown and is trying to destroy my life out of pure spite. Sign the papers right now so we can secure the patents and save the company." The oldest investor, a man named Richard, looked incredibly confused. "Marcus, you told us the hacker was an anonymous foreign entity." Richard stated, his brow furrowed in anger. "You did not mention it was your own wife." "She is not just his wife, Richard," I said, pulling a thick stack of legal documents from Eleanor and stepping forward. "My name is Charmaine Brooks. I am the sole managing director of Vesper Capital. 2 years ago, when this company was secretly weeks away from total bankruptcy, I purchased your primary commercial debt. Marcus did not tell you because his fragile ego could not handle the fact that his wife had to bail him out. And he certainly did not tell you that he defaulted on the modified payment schedule last night." I tossed the heavy documents onto the center of the mahogany table, letting them slide toward the investors. "The corporate accounts were not hacked," I explained clearly. "They were legally seized by my firm. The proprietary patents you are currently trying to sell in a panic fire sale are officially registered as collateral under my primary lien. If you sign those papers and attempt to transfer those assets today, you will be committing federal fraud by attempting to liquidate secured property without the consent of the primary debt holder." The investors stared at the documents and then turned their collective piercing gaze toward Marcus. He was gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles were completely white. "Marcus," Richard demanded, his voice dangerously low, "is this true? Have you been hiding a massive commercial default from the board for 2 years? Did you lie to us about the financial health of this company?" Marcus opened his mouth, but absolutely no words came out. He was completely trapped. The elaborate house of cards he had built using my money had finally collapsed in front of the very men he needed to impress the most. The illusion was completely shattered, and the boardroom erupted into absolute chaos. The boardroom erupted into a cacophony of shouting voices. Richard slammed his heavy hands flat onto the mahogany table, pushing his chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed onto the carpet. "Have you lost your mind, Marcus?" Richard bellowed, his face flushed with righteous fury. "You used our investment capital to secure a bridge loan without a board vote, and then you hid the default. You were going to let us sign fraudulent liquidation papers to save your own skin. The other board members were equally enraged, pulling out their cell phones and frantically dialing their own legal counsel. Marcus stood frozen at the head of the table, the gold pen slipping from his sweaty fingers and clattering against the polished wood. He looked like a cornered animal, desperately searching for an exit that did not exist. "Gentlemen, please," Marcus stammered, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "I can explain everything." The commercial loan was a temporary measure to cover a brief cash flow disruption. It has absolutely nothing to do with the core valuation of our proprietary patents. We can still execute this merger and walk away incredibly wealthy. I walked over to the table and picked up the gold pen Marcus had dropped. I turned it over in my hands, examining the engraved initials before tossing it back onto the stack of useless liquidation documents. "There is no merger, Marcus," I stated, my voice cutting cleanly through the shouts of the board members. "And there is no temporary cash flow disruption. The money is gone. You drained the company accounts to fund your extravagant lifestyle, and when that was not enough, you started stealing from the corporate charity." The room fell dead silent once again. The board members slowly turned their attention back to me. Richard picked up his overturned chair and leaned heavily against the back of it. "What do you mean, stealing from the corporate charity?" Richard asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "We established the Brooks Family Educational Foundation to provide scholarships for underprivileged youth in the inner city." "Are you telling us he raided a philanthropic fund?" I nodded, gesturing to the team of forensic accountants standing silently by the frosted glass doors. "My team spent the last 12 hours auditing the shadow ledgers your chief executive officer tried to hide," I explained. "The Brooks Family Educational Foundation has not issued a single legitimate scholarship in over 3 years. Instead, Marcus and his brother-in-law, Chad, used it as a sophisticated tax shield and a personal slush fund. They systematically transferred massive amounts of corporate revenue into the foundation, claiming them as tax-deductible philanthropic donations. Once the money was securely inside the nonprofit organization, they funneled it right back out through fraudulent vendor invoices and fake grant programs to cover Chad gambling debts and Marcus luxury vehicle leases." Marcus lunged forward, his face contorted in a mixture of panic and rage. "That is a lie," he screamed, slamming his fists on the table. "You have absolutely no proof of that. You are fabricating evidence to destroy me." I did not even flinch. I reached into Eleanor's leather briefcase and pulled out a thick blue binder, setting it squarely in front of Richard. "Let us talk about your niece Chloe," I said, locking eyes with Marcus. "My sister Vanessa and Chad always loved to brag about how brilliant their daughter was. They threw a massive party at the country club when she was accepted into one of the most elite private universities in the country. They told everyone she earned a full academic scholarship based purely on her outstanding merit and dedication. But we all knew Chloe barely graduated high school with a passing grade. So how exactly did a mediocre student secure a spot at a prestigious Ivy League institution?" I opened the blue binder, flipping to a page containing highlighted bank wire transfers. Because Marcus and Chad bought her way in, I continued projecting my voice so every single person in the room could hear the absolute truth. 6 months before Chloe was admitted, the Brooks Family Educational Foundation made a highly unusual charitable donation of $500,000. But that money did not go to an inner-city school or a community outreach program. It was wired directly to a private shell company controlled by the senior athletic director of the university. Richard adjusted his reading glasses, pulling the binder closer to examine the wire transfer receipts. "The athletic director," Richard asked, looking up with a deeply confused expression. "Why would they pay the athletic director?" I smiled, a cold, humorless smile. "Because that is the easiest side door into an elite university," I explained. "They fabricated an entire athletic profile for Chloe. Chad paid a graphic designer to Photoshop images of his daughter participating in competitive crew races. They submitted fraudulent documents claiming she was a nationally ranked coxswain for a prestigious rowing club. The corrupt athletic director accepted the $500,000 bribe from the corporate charity fund, designated her as a top-tier athletic recruit, and guaranteed her admission regardless of her terrible academic record. Once she was safely enrolled, she mysteriously suffered a severe back injury and had to quit the rowing team before the season even started. It was a perfectly executed scam funded entirely by the money sitting in this very room. The board members stared at Marcus in absolute horror. This was no longer just a story about a failing business or a bad commercial loan. This was a massive criminal conspiracy. They realized that their chief executive officer had exposed their entire corporation to federal racketeering charges, wire fraud, and tax evasion. If the authorities traced the bribe money back to the corporate charity, the federal government could seize every single asset the company possessed and indict the entire board of directors for complicity. "You used our company to bribe a college official, an investor near the window," whispered, his face completely pale. "You committed federal wire fraud to get your mediocre niece into a sorority." Marcus backed away from the table, his chest heaving as he struggled to breathe. The arrogance that had defined his entire existence was completely gone, replaced by the primal terror of a man watching his life shatter into a million irreparable pieces. "Gentlemen," he pleaded, his voice breaking, "please listen to me. Chad set the whole thing up. It was Chad's idea. I just signed the transfer authorizations. I did not know it was a bribe. I thought we were making a legitimate donation to the athletic department. I thought we were making a legitimate donation to the athletic department." The sheer audacity of his lie hung in the sterile air of the boardroom. I did not raise my voice, but the quiet authority in my tone commanded absolute silence. "A legitimate donation," I repeated slowly, "to a private shell company registered in Delaware. A shell company owned by the brother-in-law of the athletic director. You expect corporate investors to believe the chief executive officer signs $500,000 wire transfers without basic due diligence." I nodded to the lead forensic accountant. He stepped forward holding a stack of printed emails. He placed them directly in front of Richard. "Let us eliminate any plausible deniability right now," I said. "Those are internal communications between Marcus and Chad sent from their encrypted corporate accounts. My team decrypted them this morning, read the email dated August 12th. Richard picked up the top sheet. His hands were shaking violently. He adjusted his glasses and began to read aloud. "Chad, the wire transfer to the athletic director is cleared. Make sure he understands Chloe needs to be listed on the official rowing roster by Friday, or we pull the remaining funding. And make sure you bury this under the community outreach tax code so the board does not flag the expense." Richard dropped the paper as if it had burned his fingers. He looked at Marcus with absolute disgust. "You explicitly instructed him to hide the bribe from the board," Richard said, his voice vibrating with anger. "You used our corporate charity to commit federal crimes, and you actively conspired to conceal it." Marcus backed away until his shoulders hit the glass window overlooking the city. He looked incredibly small, stripped of his tailored suits and booming authority. "Gentlemen, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "I was desperate. The company was bleeding money. Chad told me the athletic director could introduce us to high-net-worth alumni. It was a strategic networking move disguised as a donation. I was trying to save the company." "You were trying to save your ego," I corrected him. "The athletic bribe was just the beginning." I turned to the rest of the board. "The Brooks Family Educational Foundation was completely hollowed out," I explained. "My accountants traced over $2 million in fraudulent disbursements. When Marcus needed a yacht down payment, he routed funds claiming an oceanography research grant. When Chad owed his bookies, he withdrew cash under the guise of a youth sports initiative. They treated a registered nonprofit like a personal piggy bank." An older board member named Williams stood up, his face purple with rage. "We sit on the advisory committee for that charity," Williams shouted. "Our names are on the tax filings. Do you have any idea what the Internal Revenue Service will do to us? We will be tied to a criminal enterprise. We could face federal indictment because of your greed." Marcus held his hands up, practically hyperventilating. "I can fix this," he stammered, wiping cold sweat from his forehead. "I can leverage my personal assets. I can pay the charity back. We can quietly amend the tax returns before anyone finds out. Just give me 48 hours. I will sell the estate. You do not own the estate, Marcus, I reminded him. Vesper Capital owns the estate. You have no personal assets left to leverage. Your bank accounts are frozen. Your credit cards are declined. Your home is foreclosed. You are bankrupt in every sense of the word. Richard stood up, straightening his suit jacket. His expression hardened, shifting to pure, ruthless corporate preservation. He looked around the table, making eye contact with every investor. Gentlemen, Richard said, his voice booming. As the majority shareholder, I am calling for an immediate emergency vote. I motion to terminate Marcus Brooks as Chief Executive Officer, effectively, immediately, with extreme prejudice. I motion to strip him of all executive privileges, board memberships, and company access. Do I have a second? I second the motion, William said immediately. All in favor? Richard asked. Every single hand in the room went up. The vote was unanimous and instantaneous. In less than 30 seconds, Marcus was officially fired from the company he claimed to have built. He stared at the raised hands, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The illusion of his power was completely eradicated. You are done, Marcus, Richard stated coldly. Hand over your corporate security badge, your company phone, and the keys to the executive elevator. You do not work here anymore. If you attempt to access any company servers, our legal team will file a restraining order before the sun goes down. Marcus looked down at his trembling hands. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his access card and tossing it onto the table. It slid across the polished wood, stopping next to the fraudulent liquidation documents. He looked at me, his eyes filled with haunting despair. Are you happy now, Charmaine? He whispered. You took everything. I stepped closer to the table, looking down at the broken man who had allowed his family to treat me like garbage. I did not take anything, Marcus, I replied, my voice devoid of any pity. You gave it all away the moment you decided my dignity was worth less than your pride. But the absolute worst part of your day has not even started yet. I continued, checking the slim silver watch on my wrist. I looked back at Richard and the board members. Gentlemen, I suggest you call your defense attorneys immediately. Richard frowned, his face paling slightly. Why, he asked nervously. We just fired him. We are cooperating. Because Vesper Capital is legally obligated to report massive financial irregularities when we seize corporate assets, I explained calmly. I transmitted the forensic audit regarding the charity foundation, the athletic bribes, and the offshore tax evasion to the authorities 2 hours ago. The moment those words left my mouth, the atmosphere in the room completely shattered. Richard staggered backward, clutching his chest as if he were having a physical reaction to the sheer magnitude of the liability. You reported us to the federal government. Richard gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. We are a publicly traded entity, Charmaine. The stock price will instantly drop to zero. The Securities and Exchange Commission will suspend trading immediately. You just wiped out millions of dollars of shareholder equity. I looked at him with zero sympathy. You wiped out your own equity, Richard, when you allowed a narcissist to run your oversight committee without asking a single question, I replied. You let him leverage your entire portfolio to fund his lifestyle. Do not blame the whistleblower for the fire you allowed to burn. Suddenly, a loud commotion erupted in the reception area outside the executive suite. The sound of shouting voices and heavy footsteps rushing down the corridor pierced through the thick glass walls of the boardroom. Marcus whipped his head toward the door, his eyes wide with a primal, animalistic terror. He knew exactly what that sound meant. He scrambled backward, tripping over the overturned leather chair and crashing onto the carpet. The heavy double doors of the boardroom violently swung open, hitting the wall with a deafening crack. Over a dozen federal agents swarmed into the room. They wore dark, tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission emblazoned across their backs. It was a fully coordinated multi-agency federal raid. Nobody move, a tall senior federal agent commanded, stepping into the center of the room and holding up a clipboard with a judge's signature. Step away from the tables. Leave all electronic devices, laptops, and cellular phones exactly where they are. This is a federal search warrant for the entire premises regarding active investigations into corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and tax evasion. The boardroom descended into absolute pandemonium. The minority investors immediately raised their hands, backing against the walls like frightened children. "Do not shoot! We are just investors," one of them yelled, completely losing his composure. "We had absolutely no idea about the charity fraud. We just fired him. We just voted to remove him." The senior FBI agent ignored their pathetic pleas. He signaled to his team, and agents immediately began sweeping the room. Two agents wearing latex gloves approached the mahogany table and carefully bagged the fraudulent liquidation documents Marcus had desperately tried to force the board to sign. Another agent confiscated the gold pen and the corporate access badge Marcus had just surrendered. Marcus was still sprawled on the floor, shaking uncontrollably. He looked up at the federal agents, tears streaming down his face, ruining his perfectly manicured image. "You have to understand," Marcus pleaded, his voice high-pitched and frantic. "This is a misunderstanding. I was just the chief executive. The chief financial officer handled the charity distributions. My brother-in-law handled the athletic donations. I am cooperating. I can give you all their names." He was instantly turning on his own family, desperately trying to throw Chad under the bus to save himself. It was a pathetic display of cowardice, but it was exactly what I expected from him. The senior agent walked over to Marcus, looking down at him with an expression of complete disgust. "Save it for the grand jury, Mr. Brooks," the agent said sharply. "We already have the decrypted emails, the forged vendor invoices, and the offshore routing numbers." Two agents hauled Marcus to his feet forcefully, turning him around and pulling his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoing in the silent boardroom was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Eleanor stepped forward, calmly opening her leather briefcase. She approached the senior SEC investigator coordinating the document seizure. "I am Eleanor Vance, representing Vesper Capital," she stated, handing over a thick encrypted hard drive. "My client is the primary lien holder of this corporate entity. We seized the operating accounts this morning due to commercial default. This drive contains the complete forensic audit our accountants conducted over the past 12 hours, including the shadow ledgers and the offshore tax shelters. We are fully cooperating with the federal investigation." The investigator took the hard drive, nodding appreciatively. "Thank you, counselor," the investigator replied. "This will save us weeks of subpoena requests. The building is officially locked down. We are seizing all physical servers on the lower levels and freezing all remaining assets tied to the Brooks Family Educational Foundation." As the agents began systematically bagging every laptop and filing cabinet in the room, Marcus was physically dragged toward the exit. He struggled against the grip of the federal agents, twisting his neck to look back at me one last time. His face was a mask of pure hatred and absolute devastation. "You ruined me, Charmaine," he screamed, his voice echoing down the executive hallway as they pulled him away. "You ruined my family." I walked slowly to the doorway, watching the federal agents march him past the rows of cubicles where dozens of his former employees stood watching in stunned silence. He was doing a public perp walk through his own corporate headquarters, the ultimate humiliation for a man whose entire existence relied on projecting superiority. "I did not ruin you, Marcus," I whispered to the empty hallway, watching the elevator doors close behind him. "You just finally met the consequences of your own arrogance." The corporate raid was executed flawlessly. The board members were detained for questioning their lucrative careers, permanently stained by the massive federal scandal. The company Marcus claimed to have built from the ground up was completely dismantled in a single afternoon. But my work was not entirely finished. I walked out of the boardroom, leaving the federal agents to tear apart the executive suite. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an alert from my security team back at the estate. Chad and Vanessa had been successfully evicted, but the fallout from their exposed secrets was currently setting off a massive chain reaction across the city. It was time to deal with the rest of the hypocrites who had dared to tell me to know my place. I settled into the town car as it pulled away. Eleanor sat beside me reviewing updates. The raid on Marcus was already making breaking news. Meanwhile, my legal team had delivered the red folder to the state bar and the district attorney. Chad thought he could simply walk away from the foreclosed penthouse and somehow salvage his law career. He underestimated how fast his house of cards was collapsing. I tapped the thick glass divider and gave the driver a new destination. We were heading straight to the prestigious downtown offices of his elite wealth management firm. Chad was a senior partner at a firm that prided itself on impeccable ethics. He had cultivated an image of absolute superiority. He looked down on anyone who did not possess a trust fund or an Ivy League pedigree. Now he was a desperate man backed into a corner. As we pulled up, I could see flashing police lights reflected in the revolving doors. Eleanor and I bypassed the lobby security and took the private elevator directly to the executive floor. The scene unfolding in the polished marble hallway was a mirror image of the chaos I had just left behind at Marcus headquarters. This time, it was much more personal. Several uniformed police officers and two plainclothes detectives were standing inside the glass-walled corner office that belonged to Chad. The managing partners of the firm were gathered in the hallway speaking in hushed, terrified whispers. They were watching their supposedly brilliant colleague completely self-destruct. I walked quietly down the corridor, standing just outside the open door of his office. Chad was frantically stuffing files into a leather briefcase, his hands shaking so violently he kept dropping papers onto the pristine carpet. He looked terrible. His expensive silk tie was torn, his hair was a mess, and his face was slick with terrified sweat. He was screaming at the detectives, demanding professional courtesy and threatening them with civil rights lawsuits. He was trying to use his vocabulary as a weapon, but the detectives were entirely unimpressed. "Mr. Brooks," a tall detective said, his voice projecting absolute authority, "you need to step away from the desk and put your hands behind your back. We have a felony warrant for your arrest regarding first-degree forgery, grand larceny, and wire fraud. We also have an emergency suspension order from the State Bar Association. Your license to practice law in this state is officially revoked pending a full criminal investigation." Chad froze, his hands hovering over his open briefcase. The words hit him like physical blows. Disbarred, he choked out, his voice cracking. "You cannot disbar me. I am a senior partner. I have clients who depend on me. There has been a massive misunderstanding regarding a secondary mortgage. It is a private marital dispute. You have absolutely no jurisdiction to raid my office over a civil real estate matter." The detective pulled a heavily stamped document from his jacket. "It is not a civil dispute when you forge a signature to illegally secure a $4 million loan to pay off illicit gambling debts," the detective replied smoothly. "And it becomes a federal matter when you use client accounts to temporarily float the interest payments. We have the bank records, the casino markers, and the sworn affidavit from the notary you bribed. Turn around and put your hands behind your back right now, or we will add resisting arrest to your list of felony charges." Chad finally looked up and saw me standing in the hallway. His eyes went wide with a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated hatred. He lunged toward the glass door, but the uniformed officers immediately grabbed his arms, wrestling him back against his heavy oak desk. "You did this," he screamed, struggling against the grip of the officers. "You tipped off the Bar Association. You ruined my career, Charmaine." I stepped slowly into the office, looking at the man who had mocked me just 24 hours ago. He told me I did not understand how real money worked. He told me to thicken my skin and be grateful I was even allowed to sit at their table. "I am not a monster, Chad," I replied, my voice echoing in the sudden silence of the room. "I am simply the consequences of your own actions. You forged documents. You gambled away millions. You lied to your wife and you stole from your clients. I just provided the receipts." The officers forced his hands behind his back, and the sharp click of the handcuffs echoed off the glass walls. "You have the right to remain silent." The detective began reading him his rights. As they marched him out of the office, the managing partners of his firm stepped aside, refusing to even make eye contact with him. They were already drafting the press release to formally sever all ties. He was completely exiled from the elitist world he loved. Just as they reached the elevator, the doors opened and Vanessa stepped out. She was accompanied by two sharp divorce attorneys. She looked at Chad in handcuffs, and her expression was completely devoid of any remaining affection. It was pure, absolute disgust. "Vanessa, please tell them you gave me permission to sign the mortgage," Chad pleaded, his voice breaking. "If you testify, I can beat the forgery charges." Vanessa stared right through him without shedding a single tear. "My lawyers just filed the divorce papers, Chad," she said coldly. "I am petitioning for full custody and filing a civil suit against you. You are completely dead to me." She turned and walked away down the long marble corridor. The elevator doors closed, cutting off his sobs. I watched the glowing numbers descend, feeling the heavy, toxic weight of my family finally lifting off my shoulders. But there was still one final person left who desperately needed to face the harsh consequences of the brand new reality I had created today. 2 weeks passed since the spectacular collapse of Marcus and Chad. The dust had finally settled over the wreckage of their fake empires. Marcus was sitting in a federal holding cell awaiting trial for corporate fraud. Chad was living in a cheap roadside motel, stripped of his law license and drowning in civil lawsuits filed by Vanessa. But there was still one final person who desperately needed to face the harsh consequences of the brand new reality I had created. Chloe. The 19-year-old former sorority queen had experienced perhaps the steepest fall from grace. She had built her entire identity on a foundation of absolute arrogance, proudly throwing red wine on me at a family dinner, calling me a parasite from the slums. Now she was about to learn exactly how the real world treated people without trust funds. When the university officially expelled her, Chloe expected her elite circle of wealthy friends to catch her. She expected to couch surf in luxury campus apartments until her family somehow fixed the misunderstanding. But high society friendships are entirely transactional. The moment the federal indictments hit the tabloids, her status evaporated completely. Her calls went straight to voicemail. Her texts were left unread. She was officially a social pariah, entirely exiled from the glittering world she thought she ruled. With her luxury vehicle repossessed and her secondary platinum cards canceled, she had absolutely no way to support herself. She could not turn to her mother because Vanessa had frozen all remaining assets for the divorce proceedings and moved into a secure condominium that strictly prohibited long-term guests. Chloe was completely on her own. But the absolute worst part of her new reality was the financial trap her own father had set for her. In the frantic months leading up to the collapse, Chad had become desperately reckless. When his own credit was exhausted by his casino markers, he committed the ultimate betrayal. He used Chloe's social security number to fraudulently open multiple high-limit credit cards and predatory personal loans to continue feeding his gambling addiction. He had assumed he would eventually win it all back. Instead, he completely destroyed her credit score before her adult life had even started. The debt collectors were absolutely relentless, calling her phone from dawn until dusk, threatening wage garnishment. With over $80,000 of high-interest debt suddenly registered in her name, Chloe was backed into a corner. She had to get a minimum wage job just to survive. I found her on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. My private investigator had easily tracked her down to a rundown fast food diner on the industrial outskirts of the city, a place located miles away from the upscale boutiques she used to frequent. I parked my Blacktown car across the street and watched through the tinted windows. The glowing neon sign flickered erratically, casting a harsh red light over the wet pavement. I stepped out, opening my umbrella, and pushed through the heavy glass doors. The air inside smelled strongly of stale fry oil and cheap bleach. The diner was mostly empty, save for a few weary truck drivers drinking black coffee in the corner booths. I walked up to the front counter and waited quietly. A moment later, the kitchen doors swung open, and Chloe stepped out carrying a plastic tray of dirty dishes. She froze the moment she saw me. The transformation was absolutely staggering. The designer silk blouses and expensive jewelry were gone, replaced by an ill-fitting polyester uniform shirt stained with grease. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was pulled back into a messy bun underneath a corporate visor. She looked utterly exhausted, her eyes sporting dark, heavy bags from grueling double shifts. For a brief second, the old, arrogant Chloe flared up. She slammed the plastic tray onto the counter, her face turning a blotchy red. "What are you doing here?" she snapped, her voice lacking its usual haughty resonance. "Did you come all this way just to gloat?" I looked at her, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. "I did not come to gloat, Chloe," I replied, my voice calm over the humming of the commercial refrigerators. "I came to see if you finally understand the lesson you desperately needed to learn." She let out a bitter, hollow laugh, wiping her greasy hands on her apron. A lesson she echoed, tears of pure frustration welling in her eyes. "You ruined my entire life, Charmaine. My dad stole my identity. I owe $80,000 to collection agencies. I have to work 60 hours a week here just to afford a terrible studio apartment that smells like mold. I have no friends. I have no future. You took everything from me." I shook my head slightly, rejecting her victimhood. "I did not take anything from you, Chloe," I corrected her. "Your father stole your identity. Your uncle paid bribes that got you expelled. You chose to be cruel and entitled. I simply stopped paying for the privilege of being abused by your family. You spent 19 years standing on my shoulders pretending you were flying. Now you are finally standing on your own 2 feet. It is hard and it is painful. But this is the reality of the working class you used to treat like garbage." She looked down at the linoleum floor, a single tear escaping and tracking through the grease on her cheek. "Please, Charmaine," she whispered, her voice breaking into a pathetic plea. "I cannot live like this. The debt is crushing me. My dad ruined my credit. You have millions of dollars. You own a whole company. Just pay off the debt he put in my name. Please. I will apologize for everything I ever said to you. I will get down on my knees right now and beg. Just give me a second chance to get my life back." I looked at the young woman standing in front of me, finally broken, completely stripped of her toxic pedigree. "Giving you money right now would be the worst thing I could possibly do," I said softly. "It would just teach you that you can always cry your way out of the consequences. You want your life back, Chloe. Then you are going to have to work for it. Shift by shift, dollar by dollar. You are going to learn the value of hard work just like I did." I placed a crisp $100 bill on the sticky counter. "Keep the change," I said, turning my back on her and walking out the door. The sound of her crying faded as the heavy glass doors swung shut behind me. The sound of her crying faded as the heavy glass doors swung shut behind me. I stepped out into the cold rain, letting the chill wash over me as I walked back to my waiting town car. The engine hummed to life the moment I closed the door, shutting out the depressing reality of the industrial park. I had barely settled into the leather seat when my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a message from Eleanor. The federal grand jury had officially returned a sweeping indictment against Marcus. The judge had deemed him a severe flight risk and denied bail entirely. He was currently being held at the Metropolitan Detention Center awaiting trial. And according to his newly appointed public defender, he was desperately begging for a visitor. He specifically requested me. I told the driver to head toward the federal detention center. I did not want to go to offer him comfort or closure. I wanted to look him in the eyes one last time to witness the absolute finality of his destruction. The drive took less than an hour, but the transition from the opulent world we used to inhabit to the stark, brutal reality of the federal prison system felt like crossing into another dimension. The facility was a towering fortress of gray concrete and barbed wire, devoid of any warmth or humanity. I walked through the heavy metal detectors, surrendering my coat and jewelry, submitting to the sterile and humiliating security protocols. I was escorted down a long, fluorescent-lit corridor to a bleak visitation room divided by a thick pane of smudged bulletproof glass. I sat down on the cold metal stool and waited. A few minutes later, a heavy steel door clanked open on the other side of the glass. Two corrections officers escorted Marcus into the room. The sight of him was almost jarring. The impeccably tailored suits, the expensive silk ties, and the arrogant swagger were completely gone. He was wearing a standard-issue oversized orange jumpsuit. His perfectly styled hair was messy and unwashed. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights filled with sheer terror. He looked 10 years older, his shoulders slumped under the crushing weight of his inevitable future. When he saw me sitting there, a desperate, pathetic glimmer of hope flashed across his face. He scrambled onto the stool and grabbed the heavy black telephone receiver from the wall. I picked up my receiver, listening to his ragged breathing crackle over the secure line. "Charmaine," he gasped, his voice trembling with unchecked emotion. "Thank God you came. I knew you would not abandon me. I knew you still cared. Still, you have to help me get out of here. The food is inedible. The guards treat me like an animal. I cannot survive in a place like this. I am a chief executive. I am a gentleman." I stared at him through the thick glass, feeling absolutely nothing. "You were a chief executive, Marcus," I corrected him, my voice completely flat and devoid of sympathy. "Now you are simply federal inmate number 8472. And as for being a gentleman, you lost that title the moment you allowed your family to humiliate your wife while you secretly stole from a children's charity to fund your golf club memberships." Marcus pressed his free hand against the glass, tears streaming down his face. "I was wrong," he sobbed openly, weeping in front of a room full of inmates and guards. "I was so incredibly wrong. I was blinded by pride and the pressure to maintain my family legacy. Chad manipulated me. He convinced me that the bridge loan was standard corporate practice. He set up the athletic bribes. I was just trying to protect the company and provide for you. I was doing it all for us, Charmaine. I swear to God." I let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed through the plastic receiver. "Do not insult my intelligence, Marcus," I snapped. "You did not forge charity invoices for us. You did not buy a luxury yacht for us. You did it entirely for yourself. You needed everyone to believe you were a financial genius. You needed to feel superior to me. You sat at that Thanksgiving table and agreed with Chad when he called me a charity case. You nodded when he said I belonged in the slums. You thought you held all the power because you believed I was completely dependent on your fake wealth. I can make it right," he pleaded, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the phone. "Please, Charmaine. Vesper Capital has the best corporate defense lawyers in the country. Eleanor could get these charges reduced. You can tell the federal prosecutors that the financial irregularities were a mutual misunderstanding. You can say I had authorization to move the funds. We are still married. Spousal privilege protects us. If you just authorize the legal fees, I will sign over whatever is left of the company. I will give you everything." I leaned closer to the glass, my eyes locking onto his terrified gaze. "You have nothing left to give me, Marcus," I whispered. The federal government seized the corporate accounts. The Internal Revenue Service placed liens on all remaining physical assets. The estate is mine. The patents are mine. You are completely bankrupt and you are facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary for racketeering and wire fraud. No amount of legal maneuvering can save you from the paper trail you created. You built a prison of lies, and now you get to live in a literal one." Marcus began to hyperventilate, panic seizing his entire body. "You cannot just leave me here," he screamed, banging his fist against the bulletproof glass. "I am your husband. You promised to stand by me for better or for worse. You took a vow before God, Charmaine." I stood up from the metal stool, looking down at him. "I promised to stand by a partner." I replied, my voice cold and unwavering. "But you were never a partner, Marcus. You were a parasite. You fed on my capital, you fed on my forgiveness, and you fed on my love until there was absolutely nothing left. And when you thought I was useless, you tried to discard me. I am not breaking our vows. You broke them the day you decided your ego was more important than your integrity." I placed the heavy black receiver back onto the wall hook, severing the audio connection. Marcus continued to scream behind the thick glass, his face contorted in absolute agony. He slammed his fists against the partition, begging, pleading, completely unraveling as the reality of his doom finally crushed him. The corrections officers stepped forward, grabbing him by the shoulders and pulling him away from the glass. I did not look back. I turned around and walked out of the bleak visitation room, leaving him trapped in the nightmare he had entirely built for himself. The heavy steel doors of the Federal Detention Center slammed shut behind me, sealing his fate forever. I left the Federal Detention Center and stepped back into the waiting town car. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city streets glistening under the pale afternoon sun. I rested my head against the cool leather seat, feeling a profound sense of exhaustion, but also an incredible lightness. The elaborate toxic play was finally over, and the actors had all been permanently dismissed from the stage. But there was still one final piece of business to attend to: the sprawling colonial estate in Fairfield. The house that had served as the physical manifestation of my family's arrogance. The place where my mother had demanded I know my place. I told the driver to head to Fairfield. The journey back to the suburbs felt entirely different now. I was not returning as the scapegoat daughter or the submissive wife. I was returning as the undisputed owner. When the town car pulled into the circular driveway, the massive house looked exactly the same from the outside. The manicured lawn, the pristine brickwork, the grand oak doors. But the people who had given it its toxic energy were entirely gone. My mother had quietly packed her bags and moved to a small rental apartment in another state, too ashamed to face the social fallout of the federal indictments. The locks had all been changed and the security system was armed with my personal passcodes. I walked through the empty rooms, the silence broken only by the sharp click of my heels against the hardwood floors. I stood in the grand dining room, looking at the exact spot where Chloe had thrown the red wine. I walked upstairs to the master bedroom where Marcus had arrogantly tried to wire $1 million. I felt no lingering attachment to this place. It was a monument to their fake prestige, and I had no desire to live inside their delusions. I pulled out my phone and dialed Eleanor. "Eleanor," I said, my voice echoing in the empty hallway. "Draft the transfer deeds for the Fairfield property. I am donating the entire estate to the Women's Independence Trust. They are looking for a new headquarters to expand their financial literacy programs and provide emergency housing for women escaping domestic abuse. I want the transfer completed by Friday." There was a brief pause on the line before Eleanor replied, her voice filled with quiet respect. "Understood, Charmaine. I will have the paperwork ready for your signature in the morning. It is a beautiful gesture." I hung up the phone and walked out the front door, locking it securely behind me. I stood on the porch, taking a deep breath of the crisp air. I thought about the 34 years I had spent trying to earn the approval of a family that was fundamentally incapable of love. I had played by all their rules, hoping that one day my success would finally make them proud. But they had never wanted me to succeed. They had only wanted me to remain small so they could feel big. They had used my loyalty as a weapon against me. The true tragedy of their existence was not the money they lost or the prison sentences they faced. It was the fact that they had absolutely nothing real holding them together. When the fake money vanished, so did their loyalty to each other. Chad threw Chloe under the bus by destroying her credit. Marcus tried to blame Chad for the bribes. Vanessa abandoned them all to save herself. They were hollow people wearing expensive masks. But I was not hollow. The software company I had built from the ground up, the capital, I had strategically invested, the quiet resilience I had forged during decades of emotional neglect. Those things were real. They could not be repossessed or indicted. I had walked into that Thanksgiving dinner as a woman desperately trying to keep the peace. And I walked out as a woman who realized she did not need peace with toxic people. I only needed peace with myself. I stepped off the porch and walked toward the town car. The driver held the door open for me. I slid into the back seat and told him to take me to the airport. I had a first-class ticket waiting and a brand new life to begin. I did not need a sprawling estate or a fake aristocratic pedigree. I had my freedom, my company, and the absolute certainty that I would never allow anyone to dictate my worth ever again. As the car pulled away from the estate, I looked back one last time, watching the grand house shrink into the distance until it disappeared completely. I felt a small, authentic smile spread across my face. Independence is not just about financial security. It is about having the courage to walk away from the tables where respect is no longer being served. It is about refusing to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's damaged narrative. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not destruction. It is simply realizing that you are the architect of your own empire and leaving the people who doubted you behind in the ruins of theirs. Thank you so much for listening to my story. The journey from the bottom of the family hierarchy to the top of my own life was the hardest thing I have ever done, but it was also the most necessary. If you have ever felt like you had to shrink yourself to make your family comfortable, or if you have ever had to walk away from toxic people to protect your own peace, I want you to know that you are not alone. There is incredible strength in choosing yourself. I would love to hear your experiences in the comments below. Have you ever had to draw a hard boundary with family members who refused to respect your success? How did you handle the fallout? Let us build a community of support right here. If my story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more true stories of resilience, karma, and taking back your power. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that their worth is not determined by the people who cannot see it. Keep building your empires and remember that the best revenge is always a life well lived. See you in the next one. The story of Charmaine serves as a powerful testament to a liberating truth: shared DNA does not grant a lifetime license for disrespect. The most profound lesson embedded in her journey is that true independence requires the immense courage to walk away from tables where your worth is ignored completely. For years, she operated under the quiet, desperate hope that her financial generosity and silent endurance would eventually earn her family's love. But genuine respect cannot be purchased. It must be enforced through boundaries. Society often conditions us to believe that familial loyalty is an unconditional obligation, trapping us in cycles of emotional exploitation. We shrink our accomplishments to comfort people who refuse to acknowledge our growth. Charmaine's breaking point. The moment she stopped shielding the people publicly humiliating her illustrates a vital realization: sometimes the most compassionate choice you can make for yourself is letting others face the natural consequences of their arrogance. Her retaliation was not malice. It was simply the undeniable withdrawal of her unearned grace. When the illusion of their superiority shattered, what remained was her unshakable reality. This narrative teaches us that our fundamental value is inherent, not bestowed by the validation of those using us. True healing begins only when we stop actively funding our own mistreatment, whether that cost is monetary or emotional. By reclaiming her assets and narrative, Charmaine did not merely destroy a toxic empire, she cleared the wreckage to build a healthy, authentic life. We must recognize when loyalty is weaponized against us and find the strength to cut those toxic strings. Take a moment today to evaluate where you might be overextending your grace to those who do not value it, and share in the comments one boundary you plan to set this week to protect your own peace.